Good morning. Thank you guys for coming this morning. Just quick question, show of hands out of curiosity. So how many folks here work in government? Like, how many folks work with some sort of government entity, agency to some extent? And of the folks that haven't raised their hands, how many folks have ever been frustrated by the delivery of some like government service? All right, fair. Figured I'd get everybody else. So this talk is not a particularly technical talk. I'm not going to be walking through any sort of code snippets or sort of talking in detail about methods of a particular library, but more to sort of share an approach that we're trying to use in the city of government in Baltimore that I think is particularly helpful and may start a conversation with other folks that are working in and with government around how we're using Python in certain parts of this toolkit. So I want to start, I guess, by sharing a story that gives some brief background on how we got here to this talk. So in 2012, after about 3 years abroad in Mongolia working for the Peace Corps, I had been telling my friends and family, this is great. I'm done with working in government. No more local government for me. This is it. Prior to that, I had worked for a number of years for the city of Baltimore as an assistant deputy mayor, and I was responsible for a lot of these like multi-stakeholder, multi-agency process reengineering projects that are often part budgetary, part legislative and policy, part process reengineering. And so it was fun, but I had enough and I was like, I'm done. And so there's some very persuasive folks in the city. And by February of 2013, I was back working in government. And this time I was managing, similar projects, streamlining special events, establishing regulatory and licensing frameworks for mobile vendors and food trucks, et cetera. But if I felt often like this dude here in this wheel. There were a couple challenges. Or central frustrations that sort of made me realize that there has to be a better way to approach process improvement for service delivery. One of those central frustrations was, there's this unsustainable cycle that, we could never fix things at a fast enough rate to get ahead of the new problems that were popping up. The second was, it was like you're chasing this news cycle. You structure the, processes or services that you want to improve, and you lay out, okay, this month I'm going to focus on these things, and the next quarter I'm going to focus on these things. And then Sunday, some very clever, well-informed journalist or institutional leader would publish an article about something, and it would just blow up your plans because priorities were shifting and you're working on sort of different things. So that was one critical problem that we need to solve. The other was that, and this is central to this talk, there was often a very sort of small and familiar base of people that were the problem solvers across agencies. So like whenever we'd run into some sort of public service delivery problem or business process problem in government, it was the same set of sort of small folks working on solutions for these issues. So there was, the base was sort of fixed. And so I guess that gets into the audience. So who is this talk for, right? Anyone that's in any of these spaces for any level of work, but especially the folks that are either working in government or working with government in the process improvement or performance management side of things, and you're looking to build a team or a small team to have a disproportionate impact on the way you guys do service delivery. And maybe you're thinking about trying to use Python to establish sort of a lingua franca on ecosystem to drive all the process improvement in your units and orient the team around that. So the audience for this talk is sort of geared at that. One of the reasons is that we took this approach, and partly it speaks to a challenge, is that we were seeing there's a disproportionate focus on sort of public service delivery, right? Everybody's interested in the endpoint of service delivery to the public. If it's public safety, folks are interested in police deployments and fire response times. If it's services to the public, it's people who are interested in the permitting or the licensing or sanitation, solid waste services. But there wasn't enough focus on that important internal service delivery between agencies, right? So like if you're one agency and providing service to another to buttress or to facilitate or to enable another sort of public-facing agency to provide service, like that's where a lot of the magic was happening, and there wasn't enough focus or sort of unifying language around process improvement in that space to really leverage making government delivery service better for the folks that are receiving it on the public end. So those are some of the challenges. And this is just some context on our sort of agency and organizational structure, so the folks that are working in or with government can sort of add a contextual layer to that. Don't worry about all the other stuff that's missing because it's not important. City, you have your primary, just like, mayoral office or whatever your sort of center of government is. And then you have at that next level, all the agencies. And so the agency where I work is the Department of General Services. It's sort of like GSA at the federal level, but for the city. So we're responsible for providing the internal services to support government agencies. So we have division responsible for managing facility and building maintenance. So if there's any building that houses delivery of public service, if City Hall, Housing Department, you come to get permits, health centers, police district headquarters, maintaining the buildings. Similar responsibility for fleet. If there's any vehicle that is used to provide a public service, we have those. Load packers, dumpsters, haulers, boats, police cars, whatever. And so there's a lot, because of that, there's a lot of opportunities to see how effective or ineffective business delivery of services. And so our office, the Business Process Improvement Office, is in that unit, in that agency, and we're not a consulting firm. We're government employees, but we sort of function like a sort of performance management, process management consultancy inside of the agency that's focused on how all those services get delivered. So that's, I guess, context for this talk. So we structured the office and the sort of primary goals around trying to arrive at, like, again, this lingua franca for process improvement. So the primary focuses are how do we eliminate all paper-based processes for all of our agency operations within a 4-year period. So that was number one. 2, how do we build a sort of talent pipeline that leverages national and regional institutions, academic partners, research, startups, nonprofit, et cetera. How do we sort of build that framework and leverage it to support Pillar 1 and Pillar 3? And then third is this task automation engine. So that's a lot of where this talk sort of is derived from, which is how do we steal back, the way we talk about it in offices, how do we steal back time and give it to administrative staff? And so that's identifying all manual, repetitive, administrative, research, analysis processes, and then automating those, and then using Python and sort of having that be the sort of central language, and other toolkits around the common languages and libraries that people use. How do we establish a similar communication system around doing these 3 things? And so this is, I guess, the question that I want to walk through and sort of start a conversation on that was really helpful for us, which was, if you're working in government service delivery and you're trying to build a team to have disproportionate impact, what approach should you take, and what do I need to consider if I want to establish like a shared language and a shared culture for process improvement for the office? And I know I'm talking a lot about the office, but you'll see later that this sort of approach seems to work, for us at least, seem to work if the focus isn't just on your unit, on your team, but rather the city. But like building an infrastructure that's human capital and culture related to really force a sort of shared language across the city or across whatever your government entity, organization is, to get people oriented around that and change the way they think about process improvement. So these were the things that we were like, okay, well, the roadmap isn't clear, but we need to think through these things and how these sort of variables impact, what tool we arrive at, not just what tool, what language, what libraries, like what do we use, what do we pay for? We sort of needed to, we narrowed it down to say, okay, these are the areas that we need to sort of focus on. And some of that would drive like what sort of technical skills that we need to attract, but we need to answer a lot of these questions before we got there. Give me 1 second. I'm flying through these. So this is like a basic sort of, this is after our sort of internal analysis of like what business problems we had and how to build this structure. This is what that sort of end roadmap looked like. It was, we needed to start with what business problems we had today. So I'll walk through later like what the 3 key steps are for us to sort of establish this instrument. One was assessing what the business problems are and figuring out how those impact each of these other elements to arrive at the tools. And if there's questions later, I don't want to, this could be a separate, I guess, conversation. But I wanted to sort of put this up in case questions that folks that are working in government have questions about how we sort of navigated each of these things to arrive at a particular lingua franca or set of tools for process improvement for the agency and then for the city. One of the, I guess, key sort of decision points for us was that this was not our universe. And when I say this was not our universe, I mean, the types of problem, after we did this sort of solicitation and analysis of the type of business problems and service delivery that we were seeing, we recognized that like this not only was not our problem universe, it wasn't our skill set. It wasn't our wheelhouse, right? So we weren't, the folks that we were working with in the office are not, and I'm not a statistician by training, right? We're not sitting around a lunch table having debates about, what's the best practice to avoid overfitting in your models, or, what are the best algorithms to use based on the question type or the characteristics of the data that you have. So that wasn't us, right? And so we knew that if we were going to build a team to focus on process improvement, we needed something that was general purpose. And so I guess that's a nice way to say this is why we took the Python route, not the R route, if people ask those sort of questions. Even though a lot of the problems we saw, the first step was some sort of analysis task, but we recognized that there was enough in the ecosystem to support taking a Python approach. Instead of this was what our problems most often look like, right? They fell largely into 3 categories. The first was, something's not happening. It's like, hey, something's not happening and it should be happening, right? That's the first category of business problems that we saw. The second was, hey, something is happening and we wanted to stop, but find out why, but first, before you do anything, make that thing stop happening that's happening. And the third sort of category of these business problems we were finding was we assume or we believe we should be doing X, but we don't know when X is happening because, so-and-so doesn't have the time because so-and-so is doing Y and Z repetitively and all the time. And so is there a way to sort of free up this person's time to do this other task to help detect when this thing is happening? So these were the sort of 3, categories of business problem that we were seeing that said, okay, not only do we really need to focus on Python as a general purpose language, but there's a specific set of libraries and tools that we need to be gearing people to and around based on what our sort of problem landscape looks like. I guess another one of the key decision points that we made was, there's a lot of people it's often in a negative context when people talk about, if you have a hammer and that's the only tool you have, then every problem looks like a nail. We actually wanted to take advantage of that. We wanted to sort of force everyone that not only was working on the team that we were trying to build, but also we wanted to force the conversation across city government that, hey, all you have is a hammer, and this hammer is free. And there's a huge community that's building tools for this hammer, so you need to see every problem as a nail. Any problem that you come across is a nail, and so the question should be, okay, how can I leverage Python to solve this particular problem, right? To sort of speed up the communication across not only our unit, but the non-technical, sort of non-programming people across city government, across agencies. So we were really trying to take advantage of this. This is your hammer, every problem you see is a nail. And so that also reflected, what our sort of grouping or binnings of the business problems were that we saw in service delivery. So I talked earlier about how we went through this roadmap, and we started with what are the business problems that we have through the sort of solicitation process, and what can we safely anticipate about the types of business problems that we're going to see tomorrow. And some of this, for the folks that are working in government, you may sort of inform some of that by, if you're in a political office, like the person, if governor, mayor, if they have a particular agenda and they're running on X, Y, and Z, you may want to sort of feed that into how you anticipate the types of business problems for tomorrow. But this is what our sort of problem universe looked like. A lot of the problems fell into these buckets around analysis, collecting information that either was available and we couldn't get our hands on, or other folks that had it didn't have good mechanisms to get it to us for whatever reason, but we still needed it. Automating some simple browser tasks, these sort of mini workflows, data cleaning, and reporting and documentation. So these were sort of the categories of the problems that we had that forced us to sort of choose a certain subset of tools for this, like lingua franca, right? Just to give a quick example, I guess for context, the reporting and documentation, we had, and this may be an example common across folks that are working in local government or state government. We in the city use this outcome-based budgeting process where, budget allocations to agencies aren't based on some sort of historical view of, okay, last year you got X and we're going to take inflation and 2% and COLAs and union negotiated stuff and give you this. It's actually driven by what are the key performance indicators around your services, 5 indicators for your major services, and then how do you perform against those things? So often the allocations is tied to performance. And so you have these annual and quarterly metrics you need to report out on, and you'd get these spreadsheets that are really complex and people don't know what's going on in there. And so one of the first places that we started was, okay, you guys have this headache. How can we leverage what Python and Jupyter notebooks can provide to give you sort of reproducible, well-documented steps to reproduce this indicator for you, so that when you're gone or you move on, or that you're not the person who you've got a promotion, but now this task comes around and they're pulling you away because you have to reproduce this thing. Right? So that's just like one example, but these were the common sort of nails that we saw. And so from that sort of landscape of problems, this is what we arrived at focusing on for process improvement. We said, okay, folks are going to use Jupyter and folks are going to use Python, right? That's a given, base. And in those, internally within our team and within the people that we work with and across the city, if anyone's sort of coming into this ecosystem, focus on these things. Within the existing libraries, focus on these, the ones in the green, because we know based on the type of problems that we have today, the ones that we anticipate, the categories that they fall in, the complexity of those, the frequency, the volume of those problems, the potential impact of some of those problems. We know we're going to be moving through file systems, like cleaning up stuff for people. We know we're going to have to schedule some tasks. We know we might have to handle passwords for some sort of automating browser tasks. We know we need to send notifications to people, right? So focus on those internal Python libraries. For the third-party libraries, and there's one here that's missing. I should update in the bottom half, which is Plotly. So that's the pandas, NumPy, Matplotlib. We said, hey, there's a wide universe of really well-maintained, awesome tools, but we need to be going deep, not wide in this case. So if we focus on these things, we were thinking about like, what is the 80-20, right? What are the 80% of, what is the 20%? That's right, less than 20. What is the 10% of well-maintained tools? If we're establishing this ecosystem and this tool for you, like this is the vehicle, what are the things that we can use that can help us solve or get us 90% of the way on 90% of the problems, right? So this was sort of where we landed based on what our landscape of problems were. Not just the ones for the internal service delivery between agencies, but the ones that we started to see when we're working across other city agencies. So I guess on the left side of the wall is the stuff that we didn't pay for. The right side of the wall is the stuff that we said, okay, we will invest in these things. And so I go into this detail because one of the things that we want to do is sort of start a conversation about if there's other government institutions, agencies that are looking to do something similar, you can sort of, I guess, use this as a starting point, blueprint. But so we paid for these things, right? The things on the bottom, the Meetup and Udemy, I'm referring to the sort of blue box with the red text. Those were more cultural and sort of human capital stuff, and I'll speak to those a bit later. But this was the, I guess, engine that we arrived at to say, okay, if Python is going to be the lingua franca for process improvement for the city, this is it. This is the toolkit. Focus on these things. Any questions so far? Good. All right. So I guess one of the important things to figure out if you're sort of walking through this process is like, what are the considerations that I need to be aware of, and what steps did we take to sort of arrive at like using Python this way as the engine for process improvement across our agency and across the city. The solicitation, by that I mean sort of sourcing the collection of the business problems, right? I'm using that broadly. Maybe they're analysis problems, they're repetitive tasks that people need to do. Like, what are all the things that are either done less than efficient or less than optimally, and what are all the things that are done repetitively? Because we get equally upset about those things, right? If something doesn't function well, and if something is functioning well but is done in a way that's like manual and repetitive, we're equally upset about those two things. Culture, what are the steps that you can take to establish a culture around this so that it's self-sustaining? And then what are the sort of human capital pieces that you need to like put in place or steps you can take to make this sustainable? So on, I guess, the solicitation and scoping, I want to make sure I get all of the, give me 1 second. So much of this we did through our own sort of internal like business process meetings. We kept, we set up a simple Google form and allowed folks outside of the organization to say, hey, these are the problems, and we sort of built a prioritization matrix around those and track those. One other thing that was useful was we started to follow around the CFO, just like sit in on his meetings and say, hey, we're just going to follow you because you pay for stuff and you see the problems, and people come to you for solutions, and you get all the consultant invoices. So we're going to follow you and sit on your meetings so that we can get a better sense for also like what types of problems are happening across the agency. That was, I guess, one sort of helpful piece about the solicitation of the business problems to inform like what you want to put in your toolkit if you take this approach. The second thing that was really helpful in solicitation was, going around, I don't want to call them desk audits, but like going around your agency and identifying those people that have, not the messy desks, because we don't want the messy desks, but the people that have neatly stacked sort of piles of paper. Because often for us, that suggested that these are people that are in some sort of approval path that has some sort of manual review or some sort of opportunity to really dive into or automate that process, or sort of, that was often a good conversation point. Like, what you always have these like 8 stacks of paper of different height. Like, what's going on there? So that was a helpful also solicitation point for us. Culture. There were a couple things we did I want to walk through. Give me 1 second. Find this right. So we did a couple things that were helpful. One, we set up a series of lunch and learns, and so these were free, right? I'll speak a bit later about the cost, because one of the, I guess, key takeaways is that a primary barrier is not cost, which is, I guess, less important if you're working on the private side, but if you're working at, you need to justify your spending, know that the primary, one of the primary barriers is not cost. So on the culture side, one of the things we did was we set up a series of lunch and learns that were citywide. And so the lunch and learns weren't a direct, hey, Python punch in the face, or hey, a matplotlib punch in the face. We would invite people that did interesting things where the front of the talk wasn't Python, but Python was the tool. So for example, we invited, the head of a regional sort of data firm to talk about their work in developing Baltimore neighborhood indicators and how they use Python to do all the cleaning behind that, right? We invited a PhD professor that is doing really interesting work on the predicting of stock prices based on like Twitter sentiment analysis. And he gave a talk about how you could use this sort of model to get a sense for public perception about how the government is delivering services. And so then he talked about how he used Python for that. So the lunch and learns were, hey, there's this cool thing happening. Oh, by the way, they're using Python for it, right? So to generate some interest. We also reached out to like local software engineers to say, hey, we know that folks will need to, if they're in this ecosystem, need to understand what version control is. So we had them come in and do talks on like, what is GitHub? How do you use it? Why does it save you headaches? So those sort of things were helpful. What else did we do? Oh, the other thing we did on culture was as an agency, we started a Python meetup. And so there are 2 Python meetups so there's one in Baltimore County and there's one in the city. The one in the city is our meetup. And so this is it's interesting. It's a city-run meetup, but it's for everybody, right? So the meetup will have city employees across different agencies. It'll have researchers, folks from Hopkins, Towson, local nonprofits. In fact, John, who's presenting on Sunday, he was the last speaker at one of our meetups, and he gave this really interesting talk about how to use Jupyter Labs and like how we use Plotly. So how are folks using Plotly for analysis that folks in our agency and other agencies could really see, okay, I understand where they're going. I can see how these tools are being used. So those, the meetups and the lunch and learns really help with the cultural piece. Okay, that was the culture. On the human capital side, we did a couple things. Just checking the time. One was we began to include Python teaching and training in the job descriptions and the work plans and the evaluations of employees to sort of reinforce that, hey, there's this ecosystem and this is the way that we expect folks to sort of interact. We began to use the Python meetups as a sounding board. If we were thinking about sort of reclassifying a position or creating a new position, and we wanted to get some sense for like the industry's take on that, we would leverage also the Python meetup to get information about, okay, what do you guys in the industry feel about where we should recruit for this, or does this position make sense, or does it jive with the challenges that you're seeing? We also, one other helpful thing in this area, we were able to rely on sort of local software engineers that were working in Python to help some of our own staff and other analysts like overcome roadblocks, right? So there were a lot of people that were like, hey, I'm trying to deploy this thing and like I keep running into this weird error because I'm trying to play around with Heroku. Okay, well, we met this woman or we met this guy 2 weeks ago at this meetup and they seemed interested. And so, we had somebody that was maintaining those relationships, and those people were willing to come in during their lunch break or their time and sit down with some of our team and other folks across the agency and say, okay, like this is, it was really facilitating the transfer of like best practices, right? So we're sort of leveraging a resource that didn't belong to us to help staff sort of, center around this language, this ecosystem. One other, interesting thing we did on the human capital side to support this was we started to set up these relationships with local and regional partners. One of those is we established an agreement, a partnership with this nonprofit Code in the Schools that does like, after school computer science education for high school students. And so we were saying, hey, the pipeline, we don't care if you have a master's degree or you're a barista, but like, can you do these things that we need you to do? So we went to them and said, hey, if you guys can find a bunch of smart high school students we will develop a curriculum for you based on business problems that we have, largely around like data cleaning, and some sort of like, not fully predictive, but we gave them some data problems, and we said, hey, we have a Python ecosystem. Here's the curriculum. Have students work on these projects. We'll come in the evenings, and we'll spend time with the students to make sure that they understand the data set. And you guys hire professors, and we'll pass the money through you. And at the end, we'll hire the smartest student. And so we hired this young girl who was a 15-year-old high school freshman. She's going to be dangerous. I mean, she's going to be dangerous. Anyway, that was one example of some of the human capital things that we did as part of like reinforcing this ecosystem. So she worked on stuff for us using, she primarily in Matplotlib to do some stuff for us. So she was another good addition to the team. That's on the human capital side. Just a quick example. I want to give a brief example of, let me check the time. Sort of what this looks like. So the examples I want to give are not ones from the folks that are working in the office, working on the team that are programmers or have these things in their job description, or that these are their responsibilities. I'm not talking about those people. This is not their work. This is the sort of non-technical people, the folks that, the woman who is works in accounts payable, who was responsible for making sure invoices got paid or supervising invoices. She took it on her own to, write a script that that suggests where you should go to lunch based on the sort of available restaurants in the area, because there was a manual thing that she saw every day. Somebody would send an email, let's coffee walk, lunch, let's go here. So she said, I can do that. There was another guy who's a deputy CFO who, he's done a couple things, but just one example. There was a manual task for, we have the public spending board, every Wednesday, and there's this, 90 to 100 page document of like all the spending across agencies, and we would send reports to the different division heads about like what items are on your document. So he said, well, let me just like pull this, scrape this PDF stuff, put together a summary, send it off to these folks, right? And so these are not people that were like core team, but this is like, hey, they understand that there's an ecosystem, there's like a common language for process improvement, and they're looking at all these problems and saying nails. Say, I got a massive hammer, like how do I just start like banging down these problems? And that for us really sort of, it elevated the conversation about like identifying business problems, and it changed the way people talked about and communicated about problems in government. People would then come to us and say, hey, can Python do this? Or can Python solve that? So then we knew, okay, there's an underlying problem, but they're thinking about this in a way that's going to sort of expedite the sort of discovery process, right? And sometimes they would even sort of take a hack at an initial pass, which these are just two examples to sort of speak to what we were seeing. Got a little bit of time left. I think one of the underlying principles was just this, that we were mindful that, when folks initially folks that don't come from a programming background, it looks like the picture on the left, right? Like, where do I start? Just like, there's 1,000 things I need to learn. How do they all stack up? What's my entry point? And so our approach was, we're going to lay out for you based on the services we deliver and the business problems that we have and anticipate. These are the things you need to focus on, and really communicate around these things, and don't worry about the massive universe of everything else, right? So that really helped us, like being able to communicate that to folks. And I guess the last point I want to make is the two takeaways here are, one, that the barriers to doing something like this are not necessarily financial. All right, so we pay less than, that's annually, we pay less than $2,000 a year for the services that we do pay for. All right, so we use GitHub, Plotly, Python Anywhere, Udemy, and I talked about how we use the Meetup. Udemy has been really helpful because now that we have this sort of shared language and shared toolkit, we can say, all right, we're going to pay for these, and the courses are really inexpensive, but high quality, right? We're going to pay $20 or $15 for this course that you have forever, and that, like, in our, one thing I didn't talk about, on the human culture and capital side, we carved out these Python support sessions for Python and stuff in the stack, where Tuesdays at 2:30 in this one conference room, somebody's gonna be working on Python something, like a side project or something that you're working on for work, and then the folks in the agency that work on it come meet there, and there's an understanding across all the agency supervisors that it's more valuable to have someone sharpening their sword than working on something else. So there's an understanding like, hey, if you have a lot of work, this is important. So you can participate, you can come carve out time here. So here, Udemy really helps us, I guess, build a library of like resources for folks. So there's the limited number of things that we pay for. Money is not the hurdle, is the first point. The second, I guess, major takeaway is that we saw a real benefit in going deep rather than wide, right? Just like limiting the scope of what people should focus on to force the conversation and change the way they think about problem solving in government with Python and have it become this like lingua franca. So those are, I guess, the two main takeaways. And that's all I have. I think I'm good on time, and we have, I think, 9 minutes for questions. Thank you, guys. Yeah, I saw two. Oh, I'm sorry.
So everyone can hear your question.
So I noticed on your slide where you showed the packages that you tend to use, a lot of them had to do with scraping PDFs. And so a lot of the talk was about how you sort of accommodate people's work processes using Python. So I wonder if you ever sort of focused on how people might change their work processes to improve the use of Python, right? So like they might store it in a more open format instead of just in PDFs. And have you kind of tried to change that part of the work culture that people have?
Yeah, that's a good point. So specific to PDFs, we haven't yet, largely because most of the problems around the PDF space are, hey, I need to do some analysis, and somebody just gave me this stack of paper, and I don't want to spend 2 weeks typing up all the stuff, or I need to do this budget projection, and someone gave me this amortization schedule, and it's in a scanned PDF, and I can't do anything with it. So that. I think I haven't seen that yet, but I mean, it's a good question. I would anticipate the more we do this, that folks will start changing the way they work, particularly around storing documents. But yeah, I feel like generally you should have your hands slapped if you're still working with paper stuff. Good question, though.
So I just have a quick question around culture. So something I've observed in a couple of different organizations is whenever you try to do this large-scale open source introduction of technology to people's workflow, where it previously wasn't there, you sort of wind up with this dynamic where everyone's trying to learn. The people who learn fastest start to look down on other people who haven't learned that fast. And particularly when you start working that into people's performance evaluations, there's now financial incentives to learn this new skill set really well. How do you, I mean, this is not particular to this one situation, but like Satya Nadella calls this a know-it-all versus a learn-it-all culture. So have you guys run into that specific problem, and how do you sort of counteract so that people are supporting one another rather than sort of kicking one another down?
Yeah, that's a good question. Fortunately, we haven't yet run into that challenge, and I think a lot of that is attributed to not that we have built good safeguards around that, because we haven't, right? We haven't built the guardrails around that, but we've just been very fortunate that the two folks at the leadership of the agency, their personalities are very strong, and they're very, like our agency director, for example, will often walk around the floor at the end of the day and be like, okay, who's working on analysis stuff? Like, who's doing what, right? And so he's pulling in people. He's often giving shout outs. He's looking to see, and maybe he's aware of it, so maybe he's doing it that way. He's looking to see who are the junior folks that are, maybe you're an accountant, or maybe you manage other field supervisors, but you're spending time on those Tuesday sessions. Like, how do I shout those people out? How do I big those people up? And so I think he and also our CFO and myself, I try to, we spend a disproportionate amount of time sort of highlighting the folks that are that we see the potential in, rather than the people that we, based on our observation of their personalities, would perceive to like be detrimental to that sort of culture. Does that make sense?
I think so.
All right, one more question.
thanks for this talk today. It was really great. So, first of all, I'm very impressed that you're getting the adoption of Python within, a worker base that hasn't traditionally been open to that kind of stuff. And so my first question is actually getting a sense of scale, like how many people have been involved in this initiative? And then the second follow-on question is actually more on the use of GUI tools to kind of extend this process without requiring that same investment in learning something like Python.
Okay, so I guess I have a question on the second one first. I'm not familiar with GUI tools. What are GUI tools?
So they're graphical user interfaces. So
Okay, oh, GUI tools, okay.
So you were talking about a lot of process automation, and so today you have these robotic process automation companies like UiPath, which is really, you can scrape a website or fill out spreadsheets and create dashboards with a drag and drop interface.
Mm-hmm.
You can obviously write Python scripts, but it might be easier to get a wider set of people within your workforce to automate some of those things without having to necessarily learn.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's not an area that we focused on, and maybe it's one that we need to investigate more. And I guess to your first question, in terms of size, our office is right now it's 3 people. We're scaling up to add 2 more. So those 3 people are engaged in those. And then on the administrative side, we typically have anywhere between like core regular people coming to these Tuesday and meetup things. From our office, usually 8 to 10 folks across different sort of work responsibilities. And then in the meetups or the lunch and learns, we have usually 8 to 10 different agencies represented, and those range somewhere between 20 and 30 people. Thank you, guys. Thank you.